At exactly 7:14 a.m. this morning, inside the long library at Windsor Castle, Prince William executed what constitutional experts are already describing as the most sophisticated, legally devastating, and institutionally transformative assertion of heir apparent authority in the modern history of the British monarchy. What happened in that room over the next 4 hours has left the entire palace establishment in a state of genuine institutional shock, not because William finally spoke about the royal future, but because of how he chose to break his silence through mechanisms so constitutionally precise and financially absolute that even the most experienced royal courtiers had no counter-strategy available. This was not a media interview. This was not a carefully leaked palace briefing. This was not the kind of emotional family confrontation that palace communications specialists are trained to manage through strategic damage control and diplomatic reassurance. What William delivered was a comprehensive constitutional and financial restructuring of the monarchy's future operations, executed through legal mechanisms so sophisticated that they bypassed every traditional palace power structure and created binding institutional obligations that cannot be appealed, delayed, or managed through the usual channels of royal influence. The court circular will record today's events as private constitutional planning meetings within the royal household. What it will not record, and what you are about to understand in complete detail, is that Prince William has fundamentally rewritten the terms on which the current reign operates and the next reign will begin, using a combination of constitutional authority and financial leverage that has left King Charles, Queen Camilla, and their entire administrative apparatus with no choice but to accept a future they did not design and cannot control. The constitutional weapon, two documents that changed everything. When William entered the long library at 7:14 a.m., he was accompanied by his principal private secretary, two senior constitutional advisors whose formal connection to the palace had been carefully maintained at arm's length, and a communications director whose presence indicated that whatever was about to happen would not remain confined to internal palace channels. What he placed on the mahogany conference table was not a single document or a formal complaint, but two separate portfolios that together constituted the most comprehensive assertion of heir apparent constitutional authority ever assembled. The first portfolio contained what William's office had titled the Constitutional Governance and Succession Integrity Framework, a 63-page analysis of the monarchy's current institutional trajectory that had required 14 months of meticulous documentation, 3 independent constitutional reviews, and consultations with legal experts whose loyalty was to constitutional principle rather than palace politics. The document methodically identified every administrative change, procedural modification, and governance restructuring that had been implemented over the past 18 months, and demonstrated with legal precision how these changes had systematically altered the constitutional balance between the sovereign's authority, the heir's institutional standing, and the consort's administrative influence. The second portfolio was even more consequential. The Duchy of Cornwall Financial Restructuring and Future Operational Framework, a 112-page financial analysis that William had developed working with corporate restructuring experts and treasury specialists over the past 9 months. This document did not just critique the current reign's financial management, it established new, legally binding parameters for how the monarchy's private funding mechanisms would operate during the transition to the next reign and beyond. Future institutional funding equals total administrative dependencies plus concert office operations. Core constitutional functions times direct succession line authority. The mathematical precision of William's financial framework was designed to eliminate the kind of institutional ambiguity that had allowed the current reign's administrative overreach to develop unchallenged. Every pound of duchy funding, every operational subsidy, every shared administrative cost was now subject to a formula that prioritized constitutional clarity over administrative convenience and institutional integrity over personal relationships. The financial leverage that cannot be countered to understand why the palace has been left in a state of genuine institutional paralysis. You need to understand the financial mechanics that William deployed alongside his constitutional authority. The Duchy of Cornwall contributes approximately £4.20 million annually to the shared operational costs of the royal household, but the full scope of the duchy's financial integration into the monarchy's operational framework extends far beyond direct cash transfers. When you calculate the complete value of what William controls through the duchy, the shared communications infrastructure, the coordinated security arrangements, the joint staff assignments that allow smaller household offices to function effectively, the grace and favor residences that house extended royal family members, and the discretionary funding that supports dozens of minor royal patronages, the total financial leverage approaches £12 million annually. Total duchy leverage equals £4 20 plus infrastructure. Access plus staff, coordination plus discretionary grants plus property, subsidies. William's 112-page framework established that, effective at the end of the current fiscal year, the Duchy of Cornwall would cease subsidizing any operational deficits that could not be justified through direct constitutional necessity. If the king's household wanted to continue funding the administrative empire's redundant press offices and extended royal lifestyle subsidies that had proliferated during the early years of his reign, they would have to do so through the sovereign's direct parliamentary grant, which requires itemized public disclosure to the House of Commons. The genius of William's financial strike was that he did not ask his father to make difficult decisions about family members or long-standing courtiers. Instead, he simply removed the invisible financial mechanisms that had made avoiding those decisions possible. He forced the palace establishment into an impossible choice: either adopt his constitutional and financial restructuring immediately, or face the public humiliation of explaining to British taxpayers why millions of pounds were being diverted to sustain administrative bloat and institutional inefficiencies. The 4-hour constitutional confrontation, according to sources who were briefed on the meeting's contents within hours of its conclusion, what followed William's presentation of his two frameworks, was the most direct constitutional confrontation between senior royals in modern memory. The king's principal private secretary, Queen Camilla's private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, and two senior constitutional advisors spent the morning attempting to find procedural grounds for challenging William's authority to implement such comprehensive institutional changes unilaterally. They found none. William had not acted impulsively or emotionally. Every mechanism he had invoked was grounded in legitimate constitutional authority that had been carefully researched and independently verified. The Duchy of Cornwall's financial autonomy was absolute and legally unassailable. The heir apparent's constitutional standing to review administrative changes that would affect future reigns was established precedent. The documentation supporting his concerns about institutional overreach was comprehensive and methodologically sound. At 9:02 a.m., King Charles himself entered the long library, having been summoned by his principal private secretary to address what was being described as a constitutional situation requiring immediate sovereign attention. What Charles encountered was not a family dispute that could be managed through personal relationships and diplomatic compromise, but a formal institutional crisis that required constitutional resolution. The conversation that followed lasted 47 minutes, and according to those briefed on its contents, represented the moment when Charles fully understood that his son had not just identified problems with the current reign's administrative operations, he had documented them with such legal precision and backed them with such financial authority that there was no procedural basis for resistance. William did not raise his voice. He did not make emotional appeals about family relationships or personal loyalty. Instead, he methodically walked his father through the constitutional implications of what the current reign's administrative expansion had created, and the financial realities of what would happen if those implications were not addressed through immediate institutional reform. The Camilla problem, administrative empire under constitutional review, the most immediately consequential aspect of William's intervention for the internal dynamics of the royal household, was what it meant for Queen Camilla's institutional position. Because the constitutional framework William had invoked placed her entire administrative operation under a level of scrutiny that it had never been designed to withstand. Over the past 18 months, Camilla's office had constructed what can only be described as a parallel administrative infrastructure within the royal household. Through what they called the Household Coordination Initiative, her private staff had positioned themselves as the indispensable intermediary between the sovereign's constitutional authority and its practical implementation across every significant aspect of royal operations. She was not just coordinating communications between household offices, she was controlling which information reached the king's attention, In what order and with what contextual framing? William's 6 3-page constitutional analysis identified specific instances in which decisions that should have been made through formal household governance channels were instead routed through Camilla's office in ways that gave her private staff effective veto authority over outcomes that the constitutional framework assigns to other institutional actors. West so. It documented communications protocols that had been modified to ensure information reaching the king was pre-filtered through her office, creating structural information asymmetries that the constitutional framework explicitly prohibits. Most significantly, William's documentation revealed that Camilla's office had been implementing succession continuity protocols that were ostensibly designed to ensure smooth operational transitions between reigns, but whose practical effect was to embed her administrative preferences so deeply into the monarchy's institutional infrastructure that they would survive the transition to William's kingship, effectively giving the current queen consort permanent influence over royal operations decades beyond Charles's death. Constitutional violation index equals formal oversight appli pleasure consultation unauthorized administrative changes times duration of implementation. When calculated according to William's mathematical framework, the cumulative effect of 18 months of undocumented administrative changes revealed not institutional stability, but systematic constitutional erosion implemented gradually enough to avoid triggering formal oversight mechanisms, but comprehensively enough to have fundamentally altered the institutional landscape William would inherit. William's vision, the Windsor Principles for Constitutional Monarchy embedded within William's constitutional position document was the most comprehensive articulation of his vision for the monarchy he will lead that has ever been made available for institutional analysis. His vision, articulated through the precise language of constitutional law, is built on what he calls the Windsor Principles, 4 foundational standards that represent a clear departure from certain aspects of the current reign's operational philosophy. The first Windsor Principle, constitutional transparency. The Crown's authority derives its legitimacy from the clarity and consistency with which it operates within constitutional frameworks that Parliament and the public have endorsed. Any administrative change that affects the practical exercise of royal authority must be subject to formal constitutional review. The second Windsor Principle, institutional inheritance integrity. The heir apparent has a constitutional obligation to ensure that the monarchy inherited is structurally sound from the first day of the next reign, without requiring administrative reconstruction that compromises institutional continuity. The third Windsor Principle, democratic accountability alignment. The monarchy's institutional operations must be structured in ways compatible with democratic accountability frameworks, and any administrative changes that reduce practical accountability require formal constitutional justification. The fourth Windsor Principle, succession authority clarity. No consort office, regardless of its operational effectiveness, can be structurally positioned as a permanent institutional power center that operates independently of the direct constitutional line from sovereign to heir. Monarchical legitimacy quals constitutional transparency plus institutional integrity plus democratic alignment plus succession clarity together. These principles constitute not just William's vision for his future reign, but a formal constitutional standard against which the current reign's operations are now being measured and against which they have been found significantly wanting. The palace's stunned response, institutional paralysis by midday, the constitutional earthquake William's intervention had triggered was producing aftershocks through every level of the royal household's institutional structure. Senior household officials who had been operating within Camilla's administrative framework suddenly found themselves in institutional limbo, caught between the formal constitutional authority William had asserted and the practical administrative relationships their daily operations depended upon. The carefully constructed network of informal understandings, administrative dependencies, and institutional loyalties that had made Camilla's office so effective at shaping household operations was suddenly exposed to constitutional scrutiny that formal review processes apply. The charitable organizations whose relationships with the royal household had been mediated through her office found their institutional footing on certain media organizations whose royal coverage had been shaped by access and information her communications network provided found their established relationships suddenly unreliable. Queen Camilla herself learned of William's constitutional intervention at 11:47 a.m. when she returned from a scheduled engagement to find her principal private secretary waiting with news that required immediate strategic response. The briefing that followed was, according to palace insiders, one of the most one-sided exercises of constitutional authority they had witnessed in decades. The sophisticated administrative network Camilla had constructed over 18 months suddenly found itself completely neutralized by constitutional mechanisms her advisors had not anticipated and could not counter. The strategic media relationships that had allowed her office to shape public narratives became useless when the matter was being conducted under constitutional review protocols that prohibited public discussion. The king's impossible choice, sovereign authority versus family loyalty. King Charles spent the remainder of the morning in what palace sources describe as the most constitutionally complex situation of his reign. William's intervention had placed him in a position with no comfortable resolution and no precedent in modern royal history. As sovereign, the constitutional framework required him to respond formally to the heir apparent's invocation of review authority. As husband and father, he faced the prospect of endorsing an institutional restructuring that would systematically dismantle the administrative empire his wife had spent 18 months building. The trap William's constitutional precision had constructed was elegant in its impossibility. If Charles resisted his son's framework with the kind of institutional opposition that protecting Camilla's operations would require, he would be publicly acknowledging that there was something in those operations worth protecting from constitutional scrutiny, an acknowledgement no sovereign can make without triggering parliamentary inquiry, far more damaging than William's proposed review. If Charles cooperated fully, accepting the constitutional review process and allowing William's documentation to shape institutional changes, he would be effectively endorsing his son's assessment of the current reign's administrative problems, requiring fundamental restructuring of the operational framework his wife's office had created. At 1:15 p.m., King Charles issued a formal statement describing William's constitutional engagement as a reflection of the Prince of Wales's deep commitment to the Crown's institutional integrity, and announced establishment of a formal working group to address the constitutional governance questions that the heir apparent has identified. The statement avoided characterizing William's concerns as either valid or invalid, but establishing a formal working group was itself a significant concession, acknowledging that constitutional governance questions required formal institutional attention. The new constitutional reality, what changes now, the institutional landscape has been altered in ways that will shape the Crown's operations long after the immediate crisis has been managed, and official communications have restored the appearance of family unity. The most immediate change is the formal constitutional review process. William's intervention has initiated a process that will examine 18 months of administrative changes with institutional rigor those changes were designed to avoid. But the deeper change is more fundamental. William has established that the heir apparent's role in the current reign is not passive observation but active constitutional engagement. He has made it institutionally impossible for palace communications to continue framing his preparation for kingship as deferential restraint, because he has demonstrated that restraint was always strategic rather than deferential, and the strategy was always pointed toward constitutional intervention. Post-intervention monarchy quals constitutional foundation plus active heir authority plus transparent governance of parallel power structures. The monarchy emerging from William's intervention will be different, not because the institution's fundamental character has changed, but because the institutional relationships and administrative frameworks that had been quietly reshaping its operational reality have been subjected to constitutional scrutiny that will either validate them or require their restructuring. Historical context, constitutional restoration in action. Constitutional scholars analyzing William's intervention are placing it in the deeper constitutional history of the relationship between the British Crown and the legal frameworks that have governed its authority since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. William has invoked not just specific constitutional mechanisms governing heir apparent authority, but the foundational principle that the Crown's authority is constitutional rather than personal, deriving legitimacy from legal frameworks rather than personal qualities of individuals who exercise it. This principle is easily affirmed in abstract, but extraordinarily difficult to act upon in practice, because personal relationships and political considerations that make abstract principles difficult to apply are never more acute than within the intimate institutional environment of a royal family. William has acted upon it with constitutional precision. Most observers had not believed him capable of deploying. The British monarchy's survival across 1,000 years of upheaval has never been the product of personal popularity or communications sophistication alone. It has been the product of people within the institution who understood, at moments when understanding mattered most, that the Crown's authority is not theirs to possess or reshape according to personal preferences. It is theirs to protect, transmit, and deliver intact to the generation that follows. The silence is broken. A future king emerges. Prince William has broken his silence on the royal future, and the palace will never be quite the same. The constitutional review process his intervention has initiated will unfold over coming months with institutional thoroughness 14 months of preparation has made possible. The administrative framework that had been quietly reshaping the monarchy's operational reality will be subjected to constitutional scrutiny its architects worked to avoid. Through it all, William will be present not as the deferential, institutionally restrained heir apparent that palace narrative management had projected, but as the constitutionally engaged, documentarily prepared, institutionally serious future king that careful preparation had made him. The silence misread as passivity has revealed itself as the most sophisticated form of institutional preparation. The monarchy's constitutional framework makes possible. The future of the crown is no longer a question being answered exclusively within the current reign's administrative framework. It is being answered through formal constitutional engagement of the person who will carry that crown forward with full weight of institutional authority, constitutional knowledge, and unwavering commitment to delivering the monarchy intact to the generation that will follow. Prince William has broken his silence. The message he has delivered is not just to the palace, not just to Queen Camilla's administrative network, and not just to constitutional scholars analyzing its implications. It is to the British people, to the institution he will lead, and to the 1,000 years of constitutional history that have made that institution what it is. The message is simple and absolute. The Crown's future will be built on its constitutional foundation, and the person who will build it is ready. The palace heard him this morning. The institution felt him this morning, and the monarchy that emerges from this moment will bear the unmistakable constitutional signature of the future king who refused to stay silent one moment longer than his preparation required. The time, as William declared through constitutional action rather than public statement, is now, and everyone inside those palace walls understands with clarity. No amount of official reassurance can soften exactly what that means.